So sorry about that, Anna. So just I know that you've been listening to me blabber about tech issues, but just to kind of give a quick introduction as I break everything. Sorry about that. So most of everybody that's going to be watching the recording should at least know of me, right? But I'm Jennifer Haynes. I'm dietitian, owner of Mood Matters Dietetics, and we are here to discuss the article that was chosen mostly on LinkedIn on ADHD and nutrition patterns. Anna, totally up to you if you want to introduce yourself. I haven't actually officially met you, except, like I said, you listening to me blather about tech.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, sure. My name is Anna Torzanski. I work with a practice called Healthier Tomorrows based in Chicago. I primarily see eating disorder clients, and with that often comes a lot of neurodivergence as well. So I'm excited to talk about the article today.
Awesome. And you said you were able to read all of it. You know, since it's just the two of us here chatting, we can kind of jump around if you want. I usually come prepared with like my notes and thoughts and stuff like that, and I have done that today. I didn't do, there was the very first one we did was on the SMILES trial, which I don't know if you're familiar with that one or not, but I brought forth the whole, the cramp testing about relevancy and recency and like all of that. I didn't do that today. Honestly, because I just have a ridiculous amount of things going on, and I just haven't had the time to do like all of that. But this is a relatively recent study, right? I do try to pick studies as much as possible, barring the SMILES trial, because I think it's a very relevant and kind of foundational research study. But I try to do research within 5 years because you can record CEUs. If you read an article for half an hour, read an article that's within 5 years, or if you do a journal study. So that allows you to get CE credit without me trying to navigate the cost and process, because my understanding is that process is a beating to get CEU credits. So it is a relatively recent study. It is a narrative review versus like a full-blown literature review, but I can't say that I've seen anything that like negated anything in this. So that's kind of like my surface level, maybe evaluation of the research. And part of what we try to do, Anna, since this is your first one, is not just like learn what the research says, but also try to focus on working with each other to make sure we're actually evaluating the research correctly. And that it's something I kind of always wanted to do, but what it ultimately led me to like, we're going to start this club right now, is I saw there was a research study on the use of the keto diet to treat schizophrenia. And several dietitians posted about like, this is amazing. This proves that the keto diet does this. And like the study did not say that in the study. And it was a very poor study. So just like the quality of study and analysis of research and stuff, you know, some of us are very good at, and some of us are just not, you know, so trying to help with a little bit of that evaluation. It is really easy to see a study that leans into your bias and just be all into it, right? So I do try to be very clear, like I to be fair, have a pretty strong anti-low carb bias. I don't think that they're helpful or useful in many situations. And I actually see clients not do well because of them. So I always try to like preface that as like, especially something as severely low carb as like a keto diet, right? So all of this hopefully is to like learn from it, but also learn to evaluate and I say manipulate, but like take the research at what its face value or actual value is versus like the abstract looks fabulous, right? So if that makes sense at all. What were your thoughts? I'm curious, not necessarily of like every piece of information in this, because it is a narrative review, there's a lot of it, but what were your thoughts on this study compared to like what you know of the research and what you're seeing in practice?
Yeah, I feel like there are two very different schools of thought about working with ADHD and nutrition, where I feel like people are either on the side of the fence of like being very compassionate and trying to just have structure that makes sense for the clients in a way that feels supportive, or people that are like, you know, it's the food dyes and the sugar that's making kids like this. So yeah, I think that's what came to mind, especially like with the few foods diet. I thought that was interesting. I think I try to keep an open mind. I saw someone posted something about a ketogenic research trial for some eating disorder in like the Eating Disorder Professionals Facebook group. And Dr. Luder, if you're familiar, I feel like made a good point of like, it doesn't matter if these things necessarily work for every single person. It matters who they like, do they work for anyone and why, and how can we use that? And so I try to keep an open mind even when there's things like elimination diets where I'm kind of like immediately bracing myself.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I feel like given the evidence in this article, at least, I don't feel like there's a good rationale for doing something like a few foods diet for people with ADHD. I feel like a lot of this article was like, oh, there's a correlation between higher sugar intake or higher intake of processed foods with ADHD in kids and like having these symptoms. I was like, okay, but there's a heritability of ADHD. And I'm imagining if there's a genetic component, more likely their parents are ADHD, more likely their parents are going to have similar behavioral and nutrition patterns, and more likely the kids are going to mirror that because the parents are making food for them. So I was like, is it the food or is it just their parents also have ADHD, so they all eat this way?
Actually, let me see if I can share my screen on the computer and I'll share some of my notes.
Yeah, because I felt like when they kept saying like risk of ADHD, I was like, is it a risk factor or is it just like an association, you know?
I think a lot of our inhibition is not the best word. Our problem with research in these studies is that we're not looking at this condition in the right way of any type of neurodivergence, right? But so I'm trying to get down to the part. Can you see that okay? Is it sharing with you okay? Because it's not showing sharing on my screen, on my phone.
What should I be?
It is not. Nope, it says it can't share screen. Okay. We're just having a total systemic failure of technology is what is happening here. Did it do it? Did it? Okay. So these are just some of the jotted down things I said. So let's see, put almost exactly what you said right here, chicken or egg situation. One for when they're seeing certain diet patterns associated with ADHD. Did the diet pattern cause the symptoms? Did the symptoms cause the diet pattern? You know, like you can't really tell with that, but you have a lot of reason for somebody with ADHD or other neurodivergence to narrow their acceptable food intake, right? And then, and that may have been the only thing I wrote down because it's not just the technology that's failing me today. But here's kind of what I think it extends to exactly what you were saying right there. Personal opinion is that we still think of ADHD as a thing that we can fix or prevent. Same thing with autism. And if we can get to the point where like we have this person with ADHD and what can we do to help with the symptoms that are distressing for that person, then we might actually see some better research from that.
Yeah.
So I also have thought, and this is just from my brain, this isn't like, you know, things I've read, how I feel about having, you know, ADHD and all of that, is that you may be looking at a dietary influence on symptoms, right? Which I think is what is actually realistic in situations like these. And you may be looking at somebody that is following a very standard American diet is worsening their symptoms to the point where it is causing problems for other people, right? So it's disrupting class. It's not, you know, people aren't hitting their productivity markers at work and stuff like that. So the diet is worsening the symptoms to the point that other people are like getting irritated and then you go get diagnosed, right? Or alternately, you have it and you have a diet that is beneficial to symptoms. And so you've got those symptoms down low enough that there isn't that threshold met to like, the kid is having problems at school. What's going on? We need to evaluate, right? I think that might be more where we're looking, and whether or not that matters in the grand scheme of things, maybe, you know, two totally different things. So I think there's a lot to it, but my thing is like when you get research on like the Few Foods diet or like any of these diets, is that they're only looking at ADHD symptoms, right? They're not looking at all of the other effects necessarily, right? So did you just place disordered eating behavior into a person that was prone to eating disorders? Because we know ADHD is prone to eating disorders, right? So like this research study that you do for 12 weeks isn't going to catch that, right? Especially because they're not looking for it, right? And so you can't take, even if like a keto diet is very well, let's just say have a very well studied keto diet, which I also struggle to find. If it has amazing outcomes and you eliminate all of the distressing symptoms of ADHD with this keto diet in 12 weeks, like fabulous, but they're not evaluating those other things either. So it's fixing the thing they're looking at, but it's not having those it depends on what it is that you're looking at. Like, they can draw lipids and see what happens to your lipids, but they can't measure what thoughts are in your head that aren't coming out necessarily. They can do things like quantify depression and things like that, but you're not going to know that in a 12-week study, and nobody is putting their kid on a keto diet unless, especially not for something like this. Obviously for like intractable epilepsy or something like that, I cannot imagine like taking my 4-year-old and telling her I'm going to do a really strict diet on her and like have any peace in my house at all, right?
One of the things I wrote down was, I feel like the research into risk of developing ADHD as a result of, I guess we could say broadly, dietary patterns, but I feel like most of the article was pinning it on sugar intake. Feels like we're trying to pin neurodivergence on individual choices. Like, I understand that there are aspects of neurodivergence that act like a true like disability and do affect how people move through the world, and there's a reason that people might want to do some sort of dietary protocol that will change that symptom and allow them to like move with less friction. And also I feel like, I don't know, it just feels like we're trying to pin it on like, well, you're kind of choosing this for yourself.
Or it's parents' fault, or I mean, there's just a lot. I will say that even if I'm just looking anecdotally, there is like a very strong, clear hereditary aspect of ADHD in my family. It presents different across different family members and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, of people that have been diagnosed or people that just had like all the symptoms and that wasn't diagnosed, like my grandfather, and things like that. So
yeah, I think you brought up a good point too about ADHD being perceived in the way that it affects other people, because even in the DSM criteria, a lot of it is like, to the degree that your boss gets mad at you, or to the degree that it causes problems in class.
It's funny because this morning I was scrolling on LinkedIn, and that was one, like the first post, like waiting for me when I opened the app, was somebody talking about that the diagnostic criteria is based on how you affect other people, like how you disturb or disrupt other people, rather than like, what are you experiencing? The being so mobile or hyperactive that you're disrupting other people, rather than like the problems that you have interacting with your peers and having poor relationship interactions and things like that, right? So I that's why I say I think that if we can get to a point where we have a better like person-centered approach to discussing ADHD, I don't think the research is going to find really good evidence for any type of intervention. And they did say in this, the only thing that they have evidence-based besides medication right now is therapy, right?
Yeah.
Which,
I hope that the research into supplementation was interesting to me as well. Not so much in that I think like, ADHD is caused by a micronutrient deficiency, but when I'm thinking about like the window of tolerance with ADHD, I wouldn't be surprised if people with ADHD will feel the effects of micronutrient deficiencies more acutely than the average person. If, supplementation improves symptoms because you're improving that window of tolerance, if you're not like super fatigued because you're iron deficient,
Yeah, I had a similar, I didn't think of it in terms of window of tolerance, but I had a similar thought in that like any deficiency is going to cause problems, right?
Yeah.
It's going to cause fatigue. It's going to have, cause like whatever. I see this a lot in depression research, which I've spent arguably more time in reading. But like, if you go down the list of like symptoms of deficiency of like anything, fatigue, depression, not necessarily like major depressive disorder, but depressed mood and, things like that across the board, right? So any deficiency I think was going to exacerbate. And when you're looking at like zinc, which has shown behavioral issues in kids outside of ADHD, like a zinc deficiency, like you said, you're almost like exacerbating the symptoms that are there, so to speak. I potentially even see the argument that calling things symptoms may not even be the best way to talk about, like when you're talking about like a person-centered, like the experiences maybe that they're having. But I found that very interesting in how they talked about vitamin D in particular, because man, people love to talk about vitamin D as like, and I will tell you, as someone that has to take a high dose of vitamin D to maintain a normal, like even a normal level, like I drop on supplementation, like I have to take like a whopping dose. Like you feel like crap, right? Like when you're deficient, especially when you get like really deficient, right? Do you have the brain processing capacity when you feel that fatigued to manage the emotional outbursts that people with ADHD can experience or take the processing steps that it takes that a normal person, like that would be normal steps that you learn as you age, even like regardless of ADHD or not, like stop and think about what happened. Sort of talk to my daughter all the time. If you could just like a split second of figuring out what's going on before we react, right? You don't have that capacity to do that anymore when you're underfed. And that, that's a lot of eventually why like in eating disorders, people will start showing symptoms of ADHD regardless of whether or not they have it, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know. But like I said, vitamin D, I felt like mirrored a lot because you'll see it across everything that supplementation only helps if there's a deficiency, which means that that's a deficiency symptom, not a symptom of ADHD that was improved or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But also telling is that they looked at 4 RCTs on vitamin D supplementation and ADHD, and only one of the researchers thought to check their baseline level before they did it. So like, what is like those other 3 studies tell us nothing. That study told us that we didn't see any improvement unless they were deficient, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think that we're going to keep getting research like that. That's like great research. It might, in this case, like I don't think we're going to get really good research until we have a better way of looking at, neurodivergence in general.
Yeah, I remember reading this like a week ago, but I think it was the Inca RCT. I felt like it had a weird protocol where like non-responders were dropped from the trial, and then like the foods that they reintroduced varied per kid because they did like the few foods kind of thing, but I don't know. That's the protocol to me.
I haven't read a lot of this, but in this study, it says the Inca study consisted of an open label phase with mass measurements followed by a double-blind crossover phase. Children 4 to 8 assigned to 5 weeks of restriction elimination or a healthy diet, which was the control, which arguably, how do you know if that was a control? It's not a control, right? Like, I don't know. And let's see, entered the challenge phase. So children in the diet group who had behavioral, so that's the elimination group, who had behavioral improvement of 40% on the parent rating scale. The challenge phase, the non-responders left the trial. So if they did not respond to elimination, they left, which I guess makes sense, right? Because what are you going to do with them, right? Like it's kind of like FODMAP. If you don't respond to FODMAP, you don't do the reintroduction phase. You just go back to, life as usual or whatever, right? Food was categorized as basically low or high allergen. The diet group responders in the second phase reintroduced 2 groups of foods consisting of either 3 high allergen foods or 3 low allergen foods for 2 weeks. So yeah, it looks like they got to pick. I didn't really read this part closely. Honestly, my eyes started crossing when I got to it. Let's see they were individually chosen and differed per child. All behavior measurements. It's interesting because I had the same thought, like kind of I think where you're going with that statement is on the food dyes studies is it was mixed food dyes and these hidden chocolate chip cookie dyes or whatever. And it's like, well, what food dyes did they use? And then you did like, let's say there was 5 food dyes they put in there. Which one did it, right? Like you have no way of knowing. Study really give us a lot of information. Like, I don't know.
I also think the parent rating scale is interesting too, because I would imagine, given most of the parents I talk to, they feel like the more intense the intervention I give their kid, like the more it's going to work, And so I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for placebo effect here where the parents think that something magical is happening because they're doing this really intense intervention for their kids where there might not actually be that much of a difference,
There's that. And I also am curious about like if you consider if home's a safe space, they're going to interact or they're going to act out more, so to speak, right? They're not going to be as masked as they may be at school or anything like that, right? So using the parent score, some of these studies that they showed, they did use like a teacher report process rather than the parents. And I don't think it's necessarily that valuable, but it also reads, again, like how much are they disturbing the parents? How much are they disturbing the teachers? Like, granted, these kids were 4 to 8 years old. So like really asking them to be accurate in their ability of like, how often are you focused? How often are you hyperactive? Like that's not going to be that helpful either. But
it's also, I feel like raises the question of like, are they, for example, if these were kids that had more like hyperactive symptoms and they go on this elimination diet and people are like reporting that they feel like the symptoms have improved, is it that the ADHD is mitigated or is it just like they're tired from not getting adequate nutrition?
I think that's always going to be an issue with some of these trials. And they did say in unpublished data from that Inca study, found an association between the few foods diet and decrease in thermoregulation. It's like, I've never heard of thermoregulation problems as an ADHD symptom, but like maybe it's something I don't know. But found an association between the few foods diets, decrease in thermoregulation problems, gastrointestinal complaints, eczema, and sleep problems, but did not show a reduction in ADHD symptoms. So like, they felt better, arguably, but also did not improve their ADHD symptoms, right? So, you know, like you would feel a lot better if your skin didn't hurt and you were sleeping and your stomach didn't hurt, right? Like, and it didn't improve. I don't know. Yeah, like I said, I think that even if the data showed like 100% of student or, you know, participants showed improvement, and the other thing is the statistical versus clinical improvement, right? I want to say it was one of the artificial food coloring studies that, you know, statistically the improvement was like, the effect was 0.21, which I even had to go back and like, what does that mean?
I was looking at the p-values for some of these things too.
And so like, it showed statistical relevance, which decreased when something was accounted for. It was the food coloring. It decreased when from like 0.28 to 0.21 when, good Lord, whatever it was, something was accounted for and it decreased the effect. But they also still said that this was not necessarily something that they would see clinically in like a normal setting, right? So like, yeah, maybe on a rating scale, we saw this benefit or whatever, but like in the individual like person or like as a group, like you're not going to see a significant difference in behavior or outcomes at school or grades or interpersonal relationships or like whatever, you know, the different symptoms or they were looking at. It's going to bug me till I find it. Exercise is small. Oh, it was when they excluded lower quality studies. So it wasn't a factor that they were looking at in the studies. So statistically worth like reporting, but clinically relevant. Like that study even did say that like there's not enough data here to say that like we should be, you know, doing this on everybody or whatever. So I think that's something that gets missed a lot is statistical versus clinical significance. You know, if somebody improves on a quantification of depression symptoms by like 10%, that's great, right? But like that's not usually what those studies are reporting. They said that's like a standard deviation of improvement, right? So they're not saying that the symptoms improve by 20% people. That would be significant for a lot of people, right? But they're saying that deviation of it off and that most of these individuals are not experiencing improvement, right? There were some that did, some that may have even gotten worse on it, right? So like you were saying, you're eliminating everything with food coloring before this study, and then they're still doing it during the study, and now you've taken away, you know, half of someone's safe foods and they're not eating enough, right? So I can see someone getting worse on that.
You have to consider only the clinical significance, but also the real life cost. Because the ADHD brain is so good at like responding to urgency that just remembering to eat can be so difficult. So limiting that variety even more, like in theory, if someone else is providing them food all the time, like in a research trial that maybe they're taking some of that burden off of them, maybe it can be effective, but in real life, I feel like it would probably make things a lot more difficult.
It was really cool. I wrote an article on my website about like how to evaluate research and kind of look at things. And like as I'm talking, like reading the study in particular, like I should probably go back and talk about some of the statistics. I'm just not a math person, and so I just didn't include it, but it might be helpful to have like some definitions on there. But one of the, I can't remember if it's like an article or if it was just somebody's website making a statement. I don't remember what it was, but she had said like we undervalue the clinician's experience in research, right? And so that's almost exactly what you're saying is that, okay, great, like this study says this, but like they get to do this study, publish it, and like move on to the next thing in theory. I know it's not that simple or anything like that, but like then we have to deal with the people. That sounds terrible too, but like we have to figure out how to make this work for this person, or, you know, deal with the repercussions of what happens when, you know, maybe they felt great with that placebo effect for a month and now they've crashed and they feel worse or like whatever. I thought it was cool to see a researcher saying like we need to be including clinicians, not just, you know, people in a lab and like quit. Like blowing off clinician experience as like anecdotal lower quality evidence. So, I don't know. I thought that was a cool, cool take to have on there, because it sometimes it seems very like the researchers versus the clinicians like going at it, and like if there could be a more of a collaboration between the two, I think we could also maybe get some good, okay, your study said this could help, but then in the real world, how does this,
Yeah.
affect or whatever?
Yeah, it makes me think a lot of like intermittent fasting, and I feel like when intermittent fasting first started becoming a thing, there were some like provocative studies that were out on it, and like I still have people coming to me being like, but what about intermittent fasting?
I don't think it's much, but yeah.
Or just like, I feel like people, I'm sure you've experienced this too as a dietitian, where people just casually, at Thanksgiving be like, so what do you think of this? Yeah, I feel like that's one of those things where like over time, I feel like the research caught up and there was more kind of nuance of like, well, but a lot of times it doesn't really work as well as we think it was, or maybe those results that we saw at first when we did bigger studies and better analyses, it was not, the panacea that it seemed to be.
Right. Or even that, in the case of intermittent fasting, that my brain is not with us, in the what is the word they used to use all the time, the autophagy, like, okay, maybe it does induce autophagy, which is a normal thing anyways, like we don't need extra fasting to cause that, but
Right.
like maybe it does increase that, but like does that also translate to anything that matters? Right, like, there's a lot of that kind of stuff that like, oh, it does this thing, but like, okay, so what, like, did it help anybody? And now everybody's hungry and pissy and whatever, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of that. I also think that it's like kind of in the same vein that low carb studying is doing. Like when I try to do an article on low carb and sleep, and it is near impossible to get any good amount of data out of the body of research, because some things consider low carb less than 300 grams of carb per day, and something or 180, or others are like a low carb diet is 5 grams per day. And there's such a big difference between what two different studies say. So like the study says low carb is great, and maybe it's because we're including more nutrition that supports serotonin and melatonin production and like blah blah blah, blah, right? But like under 300 versus under 5, there is a whole wide range of dietary difference within that, right? So even like if you're calling something a keto diet, even specific keto diet research does not standardize what that carb intake is, right? So same thing with intermittent fasting. You can look at, like, when you pull up PubMed and look at intermittent fasting, there's alternate day fasting, there's time restricted feedings, and that can go from like 16 to 5-hour windows, or like things can go, like there's no standard with that, right? So when you're trying to like gather the data as much as possible, like, well, what am I actually, like, these are testing two different things, even though they're both low carb or they're both intermittent fasting or like whatever, right? Like that's, one is a massively restrictive diet and the other is like, maybe we have a little bit less rice with dinner or whatever, or whatever carb we choose that day, right? So yeah, I don't know. There's just like, there's so many variables and stuff like that, but those are not standardized terms in scientific literature by any means. None of those are.
Yeah, for sure.
Even it sounds like the few foods diet is still considered like an umbrella, because they were talking about one in particular. So I will say that kind of the conclusion that I got was what I had read, like kind of how I talked to people about it before I read this, is that maybe it's worth trying if you want to and it's not causing issues with restriction, but like, can I apply that to like a protocol? Everybody I see who has ADHD, we're going to do this. Like, there's nothing there to indicate that even in this study, even the stuff that they come positive effect, there's still not enough there to say like a blanket statement that this thing helps, right? Yeah, I don't know. It's definitely something clients hear about, especially with kids with problems. My husband had an old coworker that reached out to me and was like, I want to put my kid, poor kid. She had found it for ADHD, but he was also bipolar and he's a lot of stuff going on. We wanted to put him on this super restrictive diet. And I questioned her. I was like, well, what do you think like, what is your goal here? Like, what is your specific goal? What's going to happen? Because you do have to keep in mind that, he is already going to be prone to an increased risk for an eating disorder, and that elimination that you're talking. And she was talking like the one that she had mentioned. It was so long ago, I don't remember, but I was like almost astounded at how restrictive it was. And just like, okay, like if he's 10% better on whatever perceived like behavior improvement that you want, but he's also like 20% less happy. Like, is that worth it if the trade-off is like severe depression, or his bipolar disorder gets worse because you're not supporting mood with this restrictive diet? Does it matter?
Not to mention, like, I mean, it depends on what medications he was on, but like I have a client on lithium where whenever her intake differs, then we also have to consult with a psychiatrist too, because those medications can be impacted by how much you're eating and what the salt balance is and all of that stuff as well.
Yeah, when I pushed back on her a little bit, and it was just basically what I said, like, there's not really any good evidence of the blanket statement. If you want to try it, maybe try something gentler. Thinking of these, because this woman is a nurse practitioner now, and so she should, in theory, but when it's your kid, it's hard to be rational too, right?
Yeah.
But she didn't even respond to that message. So I don't know what the outcome was or anything like that. But you talking about the lithium, actually, one of the things that I was looking at is, I know in a webinar somebody mentioned that Adderall depletes magnesium. And I cannot find that information anywhere, but it was said with certainty. I don't know if that was just like something that they heard, and like, I cannot find that. But you don't see a lot of information on, like statins can deplete CoQ10, metformin can deplete B12. I don't ever see anything like that. So I don't know if it's not researched, or if there isn't anything necessarily, but I am curious if there is more research coming on like depletion of certain nutrients with the different medications. Adderall, I think, is really common now. Vyvanse, I feel like, is, in theory, since it's gone generic, should be more common because a lot of people seem to like it better, but I haven't actually seen that reflected in my clients. Also, I didn't like Vyvanse. But I'm curious if we're ever going to get anything like that. The part of the article was talking about it was its effect, the medication's effect on the gut microbiome, which I think is also something that we need to kind of look into. Personally, I feel like the gut microbiome manipulation is probably going to be where we're going to see the most potential. Yeah. But also, I very rarely see any long-term benefit to single strain supplementation with probiotics, to the point that I generally actually discourage clients from it. Like, if it's a traveling thing or on an antibiotic for a while or something like that, but I very rarely see like long-term improvement from single, like, or even just like some of those that have multi-varieties or whatever with probiotic supplementation. I do see increase in bloating and abdominal distension sometimes in clients, especially if they're also trying to supplement fiber, depending on what fiber they're using. But I do see a lot of benefit to, like, I hardly ever do foot bath elimination anymore, and just throwing a wild amount of variety at them generally, it has been more effective. So I don't know if you've read the Psychobiotic Revolution. They talk about it, like the variety being more important than we give it credit for. Like, if you're getting 30 grams of fiber every day and that's all from broccoli, you're not going to get the same benefit as somebody that gets 30 grams of fiber a day and it's like, 30 plants a week is usually the number people throw out there. But when you're doing things like that, if you haven't read the Psychobiotic Revolution, not an ADHD specific book, but it is fantastic.
I did briefly look up on Google just Adderall and magnesium. The only thing that I'm seeing is that there's an interaction between magnesium oxide and amphetamine, because it increases the absorption of amphetamine. Otherwise, I'm not seeing anything about,
so making the Adderall absorb better, not depleting the magnesium. Yeah, I cannot. It was a webinar. I'm thinking potentially it might have been when FullScript introduced their AI. It's not what I wanted it to be. They made it sound like they were going to be able to put in like all of their medications and all of their supplements, and it could find interactions and nutrient depletions and stuff like that. And it's not as robust as they made it out to be. But I feel like it was that, because I know that I checked it in FullScript as one of the sources of trying to find it. So it may have been that, not like a true like webinar, so to speak. Okay. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. It would also be, sorry, with because I think I touched on the gut microbiome stuff maybe a little bit in this article somewhere.
They were looking at Lactobacillus rhamnosus, I think they were looking at and saw some type of improvement. I wrote, okay, I didn't actually write on my part of it. I put improvements of probiotics is to be expected pretty much at this point. Like anything that has to do with the brain seems to show some improvement. Sorry, that looks like that was all my own opinion on that. That like just basically what I said earlier.
Okay.
On this one.
I think they did a multi-species. It looks like
Pre-pro and symbiotic. They did probiotic supplementation early in life, and I think they looked at one in before delivery with the mother. Yeah, 4 weeks before delivery and after delivery for 6 months. Again, I'm curious with that, like that lower risk, like you mentioned earlier, is how much of that is that threshold of causing problems, like to warrant going to go get like diagnosed, right? I have no idea if I said that right. And a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled prospective study found that probiotic supplementation with daily lactobacillus from GG versus placebo seemed to improve physical, emotional, social, and school functioning in children and adolescents, per their own reports. Parent and teacher reports, on the other hand, suggested no improvement. So that was the L. rhamnosus. And then there was 2 that did multi-species probiotic supplementation, showed improvements in ADHD and anxiety, but not depression, and symptoms and severity of ADHD. And that was Lactobacillus, Bifidobacterium, Bacillus. So all the main ones they're always talking about did not specify strain or species on that. And then additionally, in an open label single arm trial, found that probiotic supplementation with Bifidobacterium bifidum appeared to improve inattentive and hyperactive impulsivity in children. But it hasn't been like, there hasn't been another RCT or like repeatable finding on that one yet.
okay.
But I can see even like my brother was on Ritalin when we were little, and like it would cause stomach problems, and he would have like, you know, if his stomach hurt, he would have more problems at school, right? Like, and so I could see in theory, if you do like a probiotic and it's fixing that problem, or if we know that like Ritalin does this versus Adderall does this versus like whatever you're using, that if you supplement that particular species, like maybe it would reduce that stomach pain symptom, because pretty much all of the all of the ADHD medications have some type of stomach pain, nausea, even the non-stimulants can cause appetite suppression. Like it makes sense to me that like you have that potential, but is the way I think of probiotics is that like they're a band-aid. Like you put the probiotics in, but you have to have the food and the fibers and stuff like that to support it. And so that's still looking at dietary changes long term, right? I think the reason that I brought up the psychobiotic pyramid or psychobiotic revolution earlier was that essentially when they look at like different ways to change the gut microbiota, diet and fecal transplantation are the only things that are like considered permanent changes. So supplementing with probiotics is not considered a permanent change, right? So it's while you're using it. And I see even clients that report improvement that wanes after a while, right? I feel like I've seen a lot more like discussion about whether or not diet is actually permanent. Obviously it's going to be permanent as long as that diet pattern is maintained. But I feel like I've seen some chatter that there may be some memory rebound later on in a diet change too. I don't know that there's enough information on that right now yet either, but you know, figure out long term. It doesn't do us any good. Just like if someone's trying to diet, it doesn't do us any good to feel better for 12 weeks. Like maybe we have a really good 12 weeks, but you know, that's a short time span relatively, right?
Yeah. I think I don't know why I never noticed this, but when I was taking a class for my master's on the microbiome, I didn't realize how, even if it's like technically a large dose of whatever bacteria is in the capsule that you're taking or whatever form you're taking it in, compared to the actual biota in your intestines, it's kind of like putting a glass of water into the ocean, you know, where it's like it doesn't raise the water level. And I would agree too, like, I think if you're not doing the dietary changes, it's kind of like just throwing a seed on the ground with no soil, water, sunlight. Like, okay, it's not going to grow.
Yeah. That's a good analogy too. I always think of like a Band-Aid because it kind of slaps it on there for a little bit, but the Band-Aid isn't what's healing the cut, right? It's you know, the other stuff, right? So yeah, you'll hear other arguments like, what's that supplement company?
Seed. I feel like that's the one I see all the time.
That one too. That's not the one I was thinking of. My brain is so dead. I actually had to ask the sales rep to stop calling me because she was so ridiculous. Oh my gosh, they're on like Full Script all the time. They were at Fancy the last few years. their whole thing is that they're looking at spores. So basically their idea that if it's encapsulated in a spore, it delivers into the part of the GI tract that it's supposed to be better, like still intact versus getting killed off as much in the microbiome labs, maybe?
Oh, okay.
What is ZenBiome is one of their products.
Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing a microbiome labs on, yeah.
So it's them. They have a whole like theory on that, and they're so expensive.
Yeah, dollar, holy moly.
Oh, you should see the literature they gave me on like decision. It was like SIBO, and here's like 10 of our products that you should take, but it's only for like 6 weeks, and then it's like 4 of them instead. And like I don't know who they're talking to. My clients can't afford that. My clients are seeing me because their insurance is paying for it. I have no like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, I know they're not going to see me. They're not paying out of pocket to see me, right? Like they wouldn't, it wouldn't be there, right? So like, here's this like $1,000 protocol that they think you should take, right? And yeah, it's cool. They do a lot of research, and like they do have some data that backs up their products, but like I don't know. I realize that I'm cheap and I probably have some money issues myself, but like even seeing the ZenBiome is the one that's like so popular with them, is $65 for 60 of them. So like it's but they have this one's for sleep, and this one's for vaginal health, and this one's for like they have all of that or whatever. And then there's various stacks and stuff that they try to do. It's so much fun. Especially when things like I use AA ProBio a lot. If somebody's like really insistent on wanting to try probiotics, I'll kind of defer over to them. What is the big that starts with a C? Whatever. Some of the main name brands are 50%, 20, 75% of the costs, and actually have research data behind anxiety, behind travel or associated diarrhea, stuff like that. Like I can't justify it, $65 for 60 supplements, and you can get, but one for $10 that has research behind it too. I'm not saying that there's not a difference in quality either, but is it enough?
Yeah. I'm always curious too, like, I guess with strains of probiotics, you might have like more specific results, but when you were mentioning like this one's for sleep and this one's for this, it reminded me of how people think different forms of magnesium are going to do radically different things for them.
Yeah, and again, like, one may work better, but is it like a huge difference? Maybe not, yeah. Absorption different and things like that. And like with microbiome labs, they do put other things. So they do like herbal supplements, which is why like this one's good for sleep, or this one, like whatever. Like it's not just the probiotic, but when they talk about probiotics, their main thing is like it's a spore, and they, it's a spore. Yeah. So I mean, like it makes sense. Just kind of like a buffered pill would break down in your gut, so you're not causing stomach ulcers, right? Like it kind of makes sense. Or like EPI supplementation will like bypass the stomach or whatever, right? But like I don't know that there's like a really clear way. Same thing with like SIBO or something like that. If you hit the wrong spot in the gut, then you're not going to get the SIBO test results that you want, right? Or most of this, when they do these studies, it's in stool samples. Like what's that difference between different parts of the colon even, or how long did it sit out, and how well was you would hope a lab would do a really good study on that. But like I don't know. I guess if it's all done at 20 minutes after or something like that, there's some like reliability or whatever.
Yeah.
I just don't think in reality, I don't believe that research is at a point where we can say that like this is what someone with anxiety looks like, their fecal footprint, so to speak. Like I can look at your stool and see that and say, oh, you have anxiety, and diagnose you with anxiety or autism or ADHD or like whatever like claims that are out there. I just don't think we have the research for that. And I don't 100% know that you're ever going to get something that specific, even though that's what people want. I don't think the nuance is ever going to allow that to be that definitive, right?
Yeah, I would imagine, because there's like in like the ecosystem of your gut, there's also like kind of like the foundation species, there's the more like commensal, so like, yes, certain strains may be associated with a certain profile, and also like they probably need other things to survive and function together to, cause whatever it is that you experience in terms of symptoms or not symptoms, Yeah,
well, and our gut microbiome isn't just what we eat, right? It's environment, and it's like other stuff too. I did think it was a little interesting that on the elimination trials that they do for ADHD specifically, it's all like allergen based that they're looking at. It's all IgE and IgDs and, things like that, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if there's like some type of like studied overlap or like increase in allergy problems with ADHD. I would say I probably don't see it enough to like anecdotally know that like, my clients with ADHD have more food allergies or anything like that. I don't think I've ever noticed a pattern like that, or I haven't noticed a pattern with my own clients.
I don't think I really have either. Yeah, I also thought that was odd. I was like, where is this coming from of like treating the allergy will somehow, do something to the ADHD. I mean, obviously you're gonna behave differently if you're not miserable with allergies.
Yeah, and I mean, I would imagine it depend on what the reaction is, right? So like my son's like moderately allergic to sesame seeds, which took us way longer than I would like to admit it did. 'Cause we thought he was picking up stomach bugs at school because he was having them like once a month. And then he had one in June and we were like, well, where did this come from? And so like that was lots of testing, but one of them was allergy testing. So he throws up with his, like he doesn't have any swelling, any itching, any other like allergy. He vomits and once he starts vomiting, he'll have diarrhea for like a day and it'll go away. So I can imagine if you're showing your allergy symptoms through your gut more than like through the skin and the swelling and like respiratory symptoms and stuff like that, like I could imagine that disturbance to your GI tract would cause all the stuff, right? The gut brain axis issues, right? But whether or not that's like directly related to ADHD, like I don't know that I've never seen it. I'm not saying it's not out there. I'm not an ADHD expert by any means. That is where my new deep dive is going to be now. But, I'm not a researcher or a therapist or anything like that either. So
yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, I'd be curious too, because I mean, if the kids have a limited range of foods as a result of their ADHD, I could see potentially higher risk for intolerance with that if they're like not getting exposed to like enough different foods when they're young, or having something like being more prone to lactose intolerance because when people are stressed or undernourished, they tend to react differently to dairy. Yeah, otherwise I don't know why they're
sharing. It's I don't know about that, but I can see it. But like with that, like we do know that there's like a reduction in diversity in gut bacteria, right? With a reduction in food variability, right? And like that seems to be honestly, from what I can tell, more important than specific species, which is the other reason that I don't love probiotic supplementation, especially if it's cost prohibitive, because you're not necessarily adding diversity, even if there's 5 different strains in that product, there's a lot more strains that are in your gut, right? So like it's not necessarily supporting the diversity that much either. But that would be like that type of diet, safe foods and things like that would restrict that as well. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's, like I said, I think the more like research that I'm like reading in detail like this, the more it's like we just don't know a lot. There's a lot of gaps in the research. Even on like, not to throw this as like a completely outside different topic, but even on stuff that I would feel like would be almost basic, like I put together a presentation at Cincy for substance use and could not find a dang thing outside of a rat study in like the 90s on nutritional impact of benzodiazepines. Like I scoured, I asked ChatGPT, I did all the things to find it and it's not there. And I feel like a lot of people are on benzodiazepines. We know it can affect appetite and things like that. And we have not even like research that like it doesn't cause issues, which arguably something I talk about a lot is publication bias, right? It's really hard to get a negative result published compared to a positive result. So if it's, there may be a study that showed no effect and it just didn't get published, right? But to me, if you're looking at substance use and nutrition, that should not necessarily be a gap. And so I feel like there's large holes, and if something not maybe blatant to me, because that's what I talk about a lot, but like if we have a gap that big somewhere, like it feels like there's still a lot of space for little smaller gaps, and it's easy to get excited about research and not realize that like, no, we're just like what we're learning from research is what we still need to learn, I feel like right now, right? Not that these are definitive. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting even when you look at kind of like broad strokes things about, recommendations on how much fat to consume in a day or proportions of unsaturated to saturated fats and those kinds of things where, we looked at I remember looking at the data in school, and it was like it's, we're moderately certain that it might do something if you conserve a different, based on like hundreds of studies, we're moderately certain that maybe there will be an effect of you eating more avocados.
Right. Yeah. And that then you get into the whole with studies like that is like the communication of that to the public is just not done well. So if we can't communicate that well, then how are we supposed to communicate the, the nuances of like the different lactobacillus species in the gut or whatever, or, and all that people take from that is that like, we're just too dumb, we don't know it, versus like, this is what we know. And like, all that does is show us all of this that still needs to be researched or teased out. Or also like human studies are great, but you also are dealing with a human. And like, there's a lot of complexity in a human, right? So yeah, I don't know. There may be questions we're never going to know just because of that, right? Or even like on the topic of like gut microbiome, if you're trying to compile research from all over the world to give you answers, well, they have different soil in this part of the world than we have here, and so their exposure to environment is different, their meal patterns are different, their fiber proportions may be different and stuff like that. So you'll even see research that shows that like if you eat more like your ancestral diet, right, people will tend to have better outcomes than if they eat like a healthy diet from somewhere else, right? And like I see that in my clients that are like first degree immigrants, yes, first generation immigrants, there you go. In that like, or second even, that they notice a big difference in like the types of foods they eat when they go home versus here. Also, usually they're walking around a lot more when they're not in the United States too. But there is some research that indicates that. So like that's a pretty good indicator that like that microbiome might be processing that food different for us than, the food it doesn't know it's over here or whatever. So, and that could be a whole foods diet in both locations, right? But it's different whole foods. So yeah. I don't know. Again, lots we don't know. Yeah, awesome. Well, I think it was a decent, like what they looked at. I feel like there wasn't anything when I was reading it that I was like, why didn't they talk about like this or whatever? Like I didn't see any like glaring like things they didn't look at. Did you notice anything like that?
I don't honestly, like I didn't know that much before this about nutrition interventions specifically for ADHD, besides just, my own clinical experience of trying to form a habit of, okay, can we eat a granola bar for breakfast?
Yeah, I think that that's where our training and learning on ADHD and autism too is going to be, is that like it needs to be a counseling adjustment, maybe more than a like new diet we need to learn about, so to speak. So, I mean, and I would argue that most dietitians, I mean, myself included, I actually missed a motivational interviewing and webinar this afternoon. Like most of us could probably use some more skills in counseling and stuff like that too. So I think that's going to be more beneficial to our clients maybe than like, like you said, avocado or like this species or, the Mediterranean diet versus like an Okinawan diet or whatever, right? So it's good to see that in research though, because I am also seeing that reflected. It's the like you need to eat that's more important for everybody, honestly. But like in ADHD, why aren't you eating? What are we going to do to fix that? And then a lot of like, they know their brain better than you do. What worked in the past. I cannot tell you how many people tell me to set an alarm on my phone to do something. It does not work. They piss me off. I don't want a damn alarm on my phone. Like, I have my calendar. My calendar tells me when I have to do something in 10 minutes, and like and that's client calls, right? Or like calls like this or whatever, obviously. And adding a reminder to go and eat my lunch is not the way for me. But I have clients that love it. And like if I use my bias and like I hate alarms going off, I would mention that to them. So just trying to really like what works for you. Or if you don't know what works for you, here are some things that have worked for other people. Pick one. Let's try it for a while and then kind of see from there. So yeah, I think that some of that is going to change. But also, honestly, I kind of take that approach with neurotypical clients as well, because I think we get this very strided like normal versus not normal, and that there's two different ways to do something. So like I see a lot of this is a neurotypical way to do something and this is the ADHD way to do something. And like, well, a lot of that ADHD advice doesn't work for a lot of people. It may work for a lot, but it doesn't work for everybody. And now the neurotypical way doesn't work and the ADHD doesn't work. And like, I guess I don't like nothing's going to work. Right. And so I think sometimes, both sides of that of the aisle, so to speak. That's a terrible way to say that, but like, what works for you in the past in general is probably going to be a better way to approach everybody, and maybe more important for ADHD and autism.
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like even with I feel like I have some clients where I'm like, you haven't been diagnosed. Not that I'm saying that in session, but I think there's still like executive functioning issues with so many other factors, both like mental health and just in life. Right. Yeah. So I feel like a lot of like accommodations that we would give to an ADHD brain could also work in other settings. I also have a client that when I suggested putting reminders on her phone to eat, she was like, I'm going to dismiss all of them. She was like, I promise you, I've tried this.
Rather throw
I've ever seen told me to do this. It was like, okay, on to the next one.
But I do hear a lot of like, well, what are the counseling techniques for ADHD? And it's almost like this is the counseling I'm going to use for someone that's neurotypical, and this is the counseling techniques I'm going to use for ADHD. And I don't feel like that's appropriate either. One, because a lot of people are not diagnosed. Like I've always kind of thought I had it, but I got diagnosed like 3 years ago. So after I like beat myself up through grad school, right? So a lot of more like, I would use this term like quote unquote like high performing people, especially women, tend to not be diagnosed, right? So like they may not know to report to you that they have it, and they just think, they suck, or it's causal anxiety or whatever.
Look at the DSM-5 criteria, like at the bottom, the caveat is like these symptoms have to be bad enough that it impacts work, school, or other things that involve other people, which I remember reading that and being like, okay, but I would never tell someone with like disordered eating that they're not sick enough for treatment. You know what I mean? Like it feels weird. Like people can have high functioning depression and we'll still diagnose them and treat them. But for ADHD, it's like, well, if you're able to do work, even if you feel like you're tearing your hair out every day, then like it's fine.
How many times do you have to burn out before?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I just like a month, like report to you that I'm like going off the rails, and then you'll someone, yeah.
But then you get diagnosed with anxiety instead of ADHD, right? So like, it's hard. It's hard. But like when you mentioned like somebody saying like you haven't been diagnosed, like it's super interesting to me because when I started talking about getting diagnosed, everybody was like, yeah. Like my mom and my husband were like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't know if y'all are just like so used to me, or especially my mom. Most of our ADHD is on my dad's side of the family, but my parents got married when they were like 19. So like she's been around that family always, right? So like to her, in her experience, like that's normal. Right? Like, so yeah, both of them were like, what are you talking about? And so I think they fully expected me to like go waste $200 in like 4 hours or something of testing, and been like, nope, you're not it. And I think they were a little off put when I was like, no, I'm starting Adderall like tomorrow, So it's not always apparent, especially if a lot of the, like for me, a lot of the hyperactivity is like inside all the racing thoughts and the, like that kind of thing. I'm not as fidgety as a lot of people. Then I used to get directed a lot for clicking pens, but or like, why are you playing with your hair again? But I'm not the type like to have that, like my daughter is like that. Just I have to get the body moving. Like I don't present that way, so I didn't disrupt class. But I think that there's just so much of that, like this person that we need to be thinking about rather than letting ADHD dictate like goals and things like that.
Yeah, I think the only thing that, and I think this is another like kind of crossover with disordered eating that I think about differently in terms of like counseling style with neurodivergent people is, well, I guess there's two things. One is how I'm asking questions, because neurodivergent people don't always respond to clinically correct open-ended questions the way other people would. Also, the interoceptive awareness tends to be very different, because it's like they could go 5 hours, and as long as they're distracted, they won't notice it. And then all of a sudden they have a moment to stop and they're like, oh my God, I feel like I have a stomach ulcer. Yeah. So I think those are the main things. But I think, again, like because they present differently in everyone, it's not like, okay, I'm going to put on my neurodivergent client brain now. It's more so just responding to how they show up in session.
I think it's a lot more awareness now, but then a lot of that awareness is like super specific things too. Like what I hear all the time attributed to ADHD is that like I'm gonna eat the same meal over and over and over again until I can't stand it anymore. And like I've never had that symptom. Like I don't want to eat the same thing over and over again. That like really drives me crazy, So there's just so much that gets attributed to, like, again, the ADHD way of things happening, that it gets really difficult. And like we have to remind ourselves, like, that may be how a lot of people do that, but not everybody is going to hyper focus on one meal until they want to barf when they look at it, right? Everybody's going to be different, or their hyper focus is going to be different. Like I like food, but I've never had one food. Even as much as I like potatoes, I don't want a potato every day, all the time, every meal or whatever, like how they talk about it on like social media and stuff.
Also like sensationalize some things for TikTok. I don't disagree that that's like someone's experience, but I feel like for most people it's probably like, I don't know, every day for 2 weeks I'm eating the same thing and not as long period. Or if it's, like they're eating it frequently, but it's not every single dinner for 6 months,
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of that. I think some things get pathologized on social media that isn't necessarily like an ADHD thing. It's like the thing that these people do, and like some of them have ADHD, so now it's an ADHD thing, But like sometimes, like when I first heard about there's a term for it, but like delayed sleep cycles and ADHD, or like some of that stuff is important just because like I felt so validated, because like the number of times, not necessarily like well into adulthood, but like up through my 20s, that like I once had a boss show up at my door, like, what the hell are you doing? You're supposed to be at work like an hour. It was a friend too, but the number of times that I just like, I cannot, like, I'm not a morning person. That's never going to change, So, but also I'm pretty sure my son has ADHD in the same way that I do. Like he presents the same way I do, and he is an early bird. He's the only one in our family, the poor guy, but he's also the only one that gets like alone time in the morning. So. But like just knowing that that's a thing that is actually apparently really, really common in ADHD, like that there was like a reason that like I'm not getting up at, all the techniques of like, do you want to work out consistently, get up an hour early? Like there's no benefit of exercise that is worth getting out of bed an hour early for you. Like that is not it. And to blanket that as like a habit forming thing for people is not fair either, right?
Yeah, I got a bone to pick with the 5 a.m. people. When I just picked my schedule, I was like, oh, you want me to do some evenings? Amazing. I have no interest in seeing anyone before 10 a.m. anyways.
I have a couple that I see at 9, just because that's the only way I could get it in the schedule or whatever. But I generally, like, I don't let my clients schedule themselves before 10 o'clock. Like they have to, I say ask me, but like I have to put them in manually. Like I don't need everybody to go, oh, 9 o'clock's available, right? Because sometimes I'm irritated by a 10 o'clock appointment, right? So like we're not doing this consistently. So that, I think some things are very validating, that like, oh, this may be related to that or whatever. I heard a stat the other day, today actually, that they estimated 90% of people with ADHD have rejection sensitivity dysphoria. I'm like, I've heard of it, but like that stat was wild to me. Like, how prevalent they think it is in the ADHD population.
Yeah, because I mean, the emotional dysregulation is also part of the diagnostic criteria in other countries, but it's not here. Doesn't surprise me that we've overlooked some of those things, unfortunately.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll get there. But yeah, all right, awesome. Well, I don't know what someone's yelling about there, so we may have found a place that we need to stop and see what's going on there. But yeah, I will eventually, I've got a lot right now, but eventually I will do the whole like removing my ums and ahs and like editing a little, like light editing, and shoot that out to everybody, so you'll get an email with that when it's done. And then this does some type of note taking that I usually include in there as well for skimmability or whatever. But yeah, I'll send that. Shoot me a message if you have any questions about anything. And I don't know if you were planning on coming to the other one on metabolic effects of trauma, because that came up on LinkedIn the other day. I was like,
was that the bonus one that's like later? Okay, I might. I'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. I can't say that I'll be any more or any less scatterbrained or whatever, but yeah, we'll do that one. But yeah, let's do that. It's good to meet you. If you have any questions or whatever, okay?
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Jennifer.
Bye.